At 3:52 on a Wednesday afternoon, Audra Keene came through the glass door of the Hearth Cross Police Annex with one hand pressed flat against her chest and the other wrapped around a child's yellow backpack. The lobby smelled of wet pavement and copier toner. A line of rainwater slid down the sleeve of her cardigan, and her breath came in short, broken pulls, as if she had run all the way from the parking lot even though her minivan was parked, crooked against the curb outside, engine still ticking. For one suspended second, the desk officer thought she had brought in a sick child. The backpack was small enough for kindergarten. A blue plastic dinosaur hung from the zipper. There was a folded picture in the side pocket. A house drawn in green crayon with 4 square windows, and a sun too large for the page. Audra held the bag out as though the weight of it had become unbearable. "It's Mason," she said. "Mason Holloway. He's gone. I only looked away for a second." Officer Gail Truve reached for the phone before she reached for the notebook. Audra's face had the loose, stunned look people wore after traffic accidents. Her hair, normally pinned with the patient neatness of a professional caregiver, had come undone around her ears. She kept turning toward the door, toward the rain, as if she expected someone to walk in behind her, carrying the missing boy. Mason Holloway was 5 years old, small for his age, with thick brown hair that grew over his forehead no matter how Caroline Holloway cut it. He had a gap between his front teeth, a tendency to answer serious questions with whispered facts about insects, and a pair of tan high-top shoes with yellow moons stitched near the outside heels. His mother wrote his name in black marker under the tongue of each shoe because Mason had lost 2 pairs at preschool and once come home wearing somebody else's boots. On that Wednesday, he had been in Audra's care since 8 in the morning. Audra told the story the same way 3 times in the first hour, and the repetition made it stronger. She said she had taken Mason to his speech appointment at the Clay Street Learning Center, then walked him across the parking lot toward Marlowe's Market to buy applesauce pouches because he had eaten through the ones in his lunch. The rain had just started. Mason hated rain on his face, so she had let him run ahead beneath the green awning. She had stopped to pull his hood out from under his backpack straps. When she looked up, he was not under the awning. His backpack lay by the newspaper rack, unzipped. She saw the back of a man in a dark work jacket putting a child into a blue pickup at the far exit. She did not say the father's name at first. She made herself say the description. She said, "He moved like Dorian." Then she sat down hard and covered her mouth as though she had betrayed a secret. By 4:20, the first patrol cars were at Marlowe's Market. By 4:34, officers were inside the learning center asking the receptionist which children had been signed out. By 4:50, Detective Felicity Doon had phoned Caroline Holloway at the accounting office where she worked 3 days a week and told her to come to the annex, not the market, not home, not anywhere she might get in the way of the first search. Caroline arrived in a gray blouse and stocking feet because she had left her shoes beside her desk and driven without them. When she saw Audra, she crossed the lobby and collapsed against her. Audra took Caroline's face in both hands and kept saying, "I had him. I had him. I am so sorry," while Caroline made a sound that seemed too quiet for the size of what had happened. Dorian Holloway was reached at 5:18 at the municipal bus garage, where he had been replacing brake drums on a line of school buses. He was Mason's father, separated from Caroline for 9 months, and already painted in town gossip as a man with more anger than judgment. He had filed for expanded custody 2 weeks earlier. There had been arguments at handovers, a cracked porch planter, and a message sent at 1:07 in the morning that read, "You cannot keep my son behind a schedule and a lawyer forever. I will come for him if I have to." Dorian admitted sending it. He said he meant court. He said he had not left the bus garage until the police called. A supervisor confirmed he had been there most of the afternoon. But most was a word that opened like a trapdoor. The rear bay had no working camera. Dorian had stepped outside twice to smoke. His blue pickup had been parked behind the garage, where nobody signed it in or out. The garage was 7 minutes from Clay Street if a driver cut behind the old glove factory and used the service road. By dusk, Hearthcross had the shape of a town that knew something terrible was happening and wanted to be seen trying to stop it. Volunteers came with flashlights and raincoats. Store owners played back security footage in cluttered offices. Officers walked the alley behind Marlowe's Market and searched dumpsters, delivery bays, stacks of wet cardboard, and the narrow gap between the market and the vacant florist shop next door. Someone from the Learning Center printed Mason's enrollment photograph, and by 7 that night, his face was taped to the inside of every cruiser window. In the photo, he wore the moon shoes, both feet turned slightly inward, hands folded around a paper cup of bean sprouts he had planted in class. The market camera over the front doors should have settled the matter. It showed Audra and Mason entering the edge of the frame at 3:21. It showed Mason's hood sliding off as he reached the first green post of the awning. It showed Audra looking down at the backpack strap. Then a delivery truck rolled past the curb and blocked the view for 11 seconds. When the truck moved on, Audra was in the frame, and Mason was not. The pickup exit camera had been ruined by rain on its cracked plastic dome. All anyone could make out was the blur of a dark jacket and the nose of something blue moving left to right. Audra watched the footage once in the detective room and then folded in on herself. Her grief seemed immediate and practical. She remembered the applesauce brand Mason liked, the way his left shoe had been tied in a double knot, the small, raw place on his thumb where he chewed when he was tired. She gave police a full list of Dorian's vehicles, his relatives, his favorite fishing pullouts, and the scrapyards where he might hide a pickup. When asked whether Dorian could hurt his son, she shook her head for 5 seconds before answering. Then she whispered, "I don't know what a desperate father can do." That hesitation would be replayed on television for days. It made Audra look honest, not vindictive, not certain, just afraid. Dorian was questioned until after midnight. He had grease under his fingernails and rain on his shoulders from standing outside while officers searched his truck. He asked for Caroline and was told no. He asked for a photograph of the shoes and stared at it too long. He said he knew those shoes because Mason had begged him to draw a rocket ship beside one of the yellow moons with a silver paint pen. But Caroline had said no. They were expensive, and Audra had laughed and said Mason did not need every object in his life turned into a project. He remembered the argument because it was one of the last ordinary arguments he had been allowed to have about his own child. No trace of Mason was found in Dorian's pickup. No hair, no fiber, no muddy tread from a small shoe. But absence did not clear him. He knew the bus garage blind spots. He knew the old service road. He knew Mason's Wednesday therapy schedule because Caroline had been ordered to share it in the temporary parenting plan. He had motive, opportunity within the kind of uncertainty juries disliked, and a message that sounded uglier in a detective's voice than it had in his own head at 1 in the morning. Audra, by contrast, had a clean history on paper. She had worked for the Holloways for nearly 2 years. She had picked Mason up from preschool, taken him to speech appointments, cooked the soft scrambled eggs he would eat when nothing else seemed possible, and sat with Caroline through 2 custody hearings. She lived alone in a narrow brick house on Ramble Street, with white curtains and a basement she used for laundry, storage, and craft supplies. Parents at the Learning Center knew her as the nanny who knelt to speak to children at eye level. She carried wipes, crackers, bandages, a spare pair of socks, and little laminated cards from Mason that said things like, "I need a break," and "too loud." The first night after Mason vanished, Audra refused to go home. She slept sitting upright in a vinyl chair at the annex with Mason's backpack in her lap. Caroline slept against her shoulder. A newspaper photographer caught them that way through the lobby window. 2 women joined by shock, one mother by blood and one by care. By morning, the picture was everywhere. Nobody could have known that photographs sometimes preserve not truth, but the exact pose a lie needed. Audra gave interviews reluctantly at first, and then with the exhausted steadiness of someone who had been forced into public responsibility. She described Mason's laugh. She explained his trouble with loud noises. She asked people not to chase any child they thought might be him because it could frighten him. She never said Dorian had taken him. She did not have to. The shape of the story did the work for her. A custody fight, a threatening message, a blue truck, a father with gaps in his afternoon, a nanny whose sorrow had no visible advantage. Dorian's life narrowed until it seemed made entirely of accusation. He was suspended from the bus garage after parents complained. His truck windows were smashed. Someone spray-painted "Give him back" across his fence in white block letters. He kept giving interviews from his porch until his lawyer told him to stop. In those interviews, he did not look polished. He looked furious, sleepless, and loud in a way that made viewers uncomfortable. He said Audra was wrong. He said Caroline was lying about him. He said the police were building a story because they liked stories better than questions. Every true thing he said sounded, to the town, like the next proof against him. What bothered Detective Felicity Doon was not one large contradiction. It was the lack of small, messy ones. In real panic, people misremembered. They contradicted themselves. They gave the wrong minute and then corrected it when a receipt or a phone log forced them to. Audra's account was shaken but smooth. She never misplaced the backpack. She never changed the order of hood, awning, truck. She never forgot whether Mason had eaten lunch. Even her uncertainty had edges. She could not swear it was Dorian, but she could describe the angle of the man's shoulders. She could not say the truck was his, but she remembered the dull blue shade. Audra remained close to Caroline. She opened the Holloway house to volunteers. She packed away Mason's perishable snacks, but left the rest of his room untouched. She washed his bed sheets and then cried, because washing them felt like admitting something. She attended a candlelight vigil on what would have been his 6th birthday, and held Caroline's elbow when Caroline placed a small paper crown on the empty chair at the front of the church hall. People called Audra brave. They said no nanny stayed like that unless she loved the child. 8 months later, Hearthcross had its first hard freeze on a Sunday night. Pipes burst across the east side of town before dawn. At Audra Keene's house on Ramble Street, water pushed through a cracked basement feed line and rose around boxes of Christmas ornaments, old lesson books, and plastic bins labeled winter crafts. Audra was away that morning. She had driven Caroline to a hearing in West Branton, where Dorian's lawyer was trying to restore supervised visitation rights in case Mason was found alive. A neighbor called the emergency number when water began running from under Audra's side door. The man who found the shoe was not looking for evidence. His name was Rafik Merton, and he worked for a small plumbing company that had the city overflow contract. He had a beard full of gray, knees ruined by 20 years of crouching in basements, and no interest in becoming part of the Holloway case. He pumped water for 40 minutes, shut the feed, and began moving soaked boxes away from the old coal chute so he could reach a valve. The chute had been painted shut years earlier, but water had softened the paint around one lower corner. When Rafik set his pry bar under the lip, a wedge of brick dust and lint broke loose. Something small dropped into the shallow water with a soft, wrong sound. At first he thought it was a child's toy. Then he saw the laces. It was a left shoe, tan canvas, high top, swollen dark from the water. A yellow moon was stitched near the heel. The black marker under the tongue had blurred, but not vanished. Mason H. The letters swam in the beam of Rafik's work light, as if the shoe had been waiting underwater to say the only name it knew. Rafik backed out of the basement without touching it again. He called his supervisor. His supervisor called police. By noon, Ramble Street was blocked at both ends, and Audra's house had become, in the words of the first warrant application, a location of immediate evidentiary concern. Audra returned at 1:17 in the passenger seat of Caroline's car. There were still photographers at the curb because the custody hearing had drawn them, and because someone had already told them police were at the nanny's house. Caroline braked so abruptly that the car lurched. Audra stared at the officers, the basement door, the yellow tape crossing her own front walk. Her face did not crumple. It seemed to empty. Detective Dune met her on the sidewalk. "Audra, we found a child's shoe in your basement." Audra looked past her to the open side door. Water hose, boot tracks, evidence markers. For a moment she said nothing. Then she closed her eyes and made the kind of small nod people make when they recognize news too late. "He had spare things at my house," she said. "You know he did. Caroline knows. He was there all the time. It has his name in it. All his things had his name in them. It appears to match the shoes he was wearing when he disappeared." Audra opened her eyes. "Appears to?" That was the first word she chose to fight over. It would matter later. Caroline stepped out of the car and demanded to know what was happening. When Dune told her, Caroline put one hand on the roof of the car and bent forward as if sick. She did not go to Audra. She did not touch her. In the months before, she had reached for Audra in every public moment of pain. Now she stood alone under the bare branches and said, "No, that cannot be his." It was his. The confirmation did not come from the name, or from the stitched moons, or from Caroline's memory of the double knot. It came from an odd flaw in the rubber toe cap. 3 weeks before Mason vanished, Dorian had fixed a loose piece of rubber with a drop of amber industrial adhesive from the bus garage. Caroline had been angry about it because the glue dried darker than the shoe. Dorian remembered. Caroline remembered. Audra had mentioned it in her first interview without being asked. The shoe from the basement had the amber repair. The discovery did not answer where Mason was. It destroyed where he was supposed to have been. The basement was processed for 2 days. The water had damaged almost everything and saved a few things by loosening them from where they had been hidden. Behind the coal chute, investigators found lint, mouse droppings, a child's sticker of a silver rocket, and fibers from a green hoodie that matched the brand Caroline said Mason wore that day. On the concrete near the old laundry sink, beneath a stack of warped storage lids, a technician found faint black scuffs at child height along the painted block wall. They looked like marks from the rubber sides of small shoes, one foot pushing, twisting, waiting. Audra's basement had 2 rooms. The front held the washer, dryer, and a furnace that banged when it started. The back was lower, windowless, except for a narrow ground-level pane blocked by a shelf of canning jars. Audra used it, she said, for craft supplies and seasonal decorations. There were plastic bins of yarn, wooden puzzles, paper crowns, glue sticks, and classroom posters she had bought secondhand. One poster said, "Use your brave voice," in cheerful red letters. In the corner behind the craft shelves, investigators noticed that the concrete floor had been scrubbed more aggressively than the rest. Not cleaned for floodwater, scrubbed earlier in circular strokes that left pale arcs visible when the wet concrete dried. The lab found no blood. They did find starch from children's crackers, ground into the seam between wall and floor, blue tempera paint, and 2 short brown hairs that DNA testing said could belong to Mason. The hairs proved little by themselves. Mason had visited the house, but when the shoe was added to the pattern, every innocent explanation became narrow and awkward. Audra told police she kept an emergency bin for Mason in the basement. Shoes, socks, clothes, comfort cards, snacks. The flood had scattered things. The shoe must have fallen from a box and washed behind the coal chute. She said she had not gone down there much after the disappearance because it hurt too much to see his things. She cried as she said it. Her tears still worked on some people. They did not work the way they had before. Caroline confirmed there had been spare clothes. She could not confirm spare shoes. She thought maybe. She was not sure. Under gentle questioning, she said, Audra sometimes bought Mason things herself and did not always mention it. Under firmer questioning, she said she did not remember ever seeing the moon shoes at Audra's house before May 18th. When Dune asked why she had first said, "That cannot be his" on the sidewalk, Caroline said any mother would say that. When asked why she had not comforted Audra, she looked down at her hands and said, "I did not understand what I was seeing." The case split open in directions nobody had expected. Dorian's lawyer filed a motion within hours, demanding a public statement that his client had been unfairly targeted. The prosecutor refused. Dune did not clear Dorian, but she pulled every box of original evidence back into the light. She and Detective Matteo Sayer, assigned after the discovery, rebuilt the first day from morning forward, not from the market backward. The difference was enormous. At 8:03 on the morning, Mason vanished. Audra picked him up from the Holloway house. Caroline stood on the porch and waved. A neighbor's doorbell camera showed Mason climbing into Audra's minivan, wearing the tan moon shoes, red raincoat, green hoodie, and yellow backpack. At 8:26, Audra signed him into preschool. At 11:38, she signed him out for his speech appointment. That was confirmed. After that, the original timeline had depended almost entirely on Audra. The Clay Street Learning Center had recorded Mason arriving at 12:04. A therapist remembered him because he did not want to remove his raincoat even indoors. The session ended at 12:50. Audra signed the paper pickup sheet at 12:53. The market footage was at 3:21. The missing space was 2.5 hours wide. Audra had told police they ate lunch in the minivan because Mason was tired, then sat in the learning center lobby reading books until the rain lightened. But no one remembered them in the lobby. The receptionist had gone to lunch. The therapist had another child. The minivan's dashboard camera had not been activated. Audra's phone remained near Clay Street from 12:58 to 3:06, but a phone could sit in a purse, and a purse could sit anywhere. A traffic camera on Bellner Avenue, dismissed early because it faced the wrong direction and captured only partial plates, had been retained by the city server longer than expected. Sayer found it at 2 in the morning after searching municipal archives with the stubbornness of a man who distrusted empty time. At 1:34 p.m., a silver minivan with a cracked right taillight turned from Bellner onto Ramble Street. Audra's minivan had a cracked right taillight. At 2:46, the same van turned back toward Clay Street. The driver could not be seen. A child's head could not be seen either. That placed Audra's vehicle at her house between the therapy appointment and the staged disappearance at Marlowe's Market. Audra said she had gone home to retrieve Mason's laminated cards because he was upset. When asked why she never mentioned that, she said she had forgotten under stress. When asked why she left Mason's name off the visitor sheet at the learning center after returning, she said they didn't go back inside. When asked why she had told officers repeatedly that she never went home, she asked for a lawyer. The first real crack came from a woman named Opal Klein, who lived in the other half of the brick duplex next to Audra. Opal was 81, suspicious of everyone, and had refused to speak to reporters because she believed reporters stole grief for a living. She had spoken to police in May and said she saw nothing. After the shoe was found, Dune returned and asked a different question. "Did you hear anything from Audra's basement that afternoon?" Opal sat at her kitchen table under a lamp with a fringed shade and stared through the wall as if the old house might answer for her. "Not that afternoon," she said. "Evening." "What kind of sound?" "A child making that little cough some children do when they've cried too long." "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I hear television through the wall. I hear washing machines. I hear people arguing with no one. I did not know your missing boy was in a basement. I thought Miss Keene had one of her little charges over. and I minded my own business. What time? After supper. Before the trash truck came next morning. Audra had reported Mason missing at 3:52. By supper, according to the official version, he was either in Dorian's custody or lost somewhere beyond the market. Opal had heard a child through the basement wall hours after that. The search warrant widened. Investigators seized Audra's laptop, old phones, paper planners, bank statements, storage boxes, and the emergency bin she claimed had contained spare shoes. Inside the bin were socks, a small sweatshirt, a toothbrush, 3 applesauce pouches, and a pair of navy shorts. No shoes. The dust outline inside the bin showed rectangular packages had sat there for a long time, but no outline matched the shoe. Under the lining paper at the bottom, a technician found a strip torn from a child's sticker sheet. It matched the silver rocket behind the coal chute. Caroline's devices, when finally examined with a warrant, were cleaner. Too clean, Sayer thought. Her texts with Audra were warm but dull. Snack reminders, appointment times, photos of Mason asleep in the car seat. No conspiracy announces itself as conspiracy, and the absence of evidence is often just absence. But Caroline had deleted her old Nanny app account 4 days after the disappearance, saying it hurt too much to receive reminders. The company retained some back-end logs. A technician sent Dune a spreadsheet at 6:15 on a cold Thursday morning in January, and Dune read it in the weak light of her kitchen before her coffee cooled. On the morning Mason vanished, Audra had checked off speech folder packed at 11:07. At 11:14, Caroline had added a private note visible only to Audra. Remember side door sticks. At 1:02, after Mason was signed out of therapy, Audra had opened the app and marked "Quiet time started." At 2:28, Caroline had opened the same thread from her office computer. At 3:43, 9 minutes before Audra entered the police annex, Caroline had deleted the entire day's care log. When confronted, Caroline said she had no memory of the entries. She said the Nanny app was confusing. She said side door sticks referred to her own side door at home, not Audra's basement entrance. The trouble was that the Holloway house did not have a side door. It had a front door, a back slider, and a garage entrance. Audra's house had a side door that stuck in damp weather. Dune did not show Caroline the next item in the spreadsheet. It was not a message. It was a photograph upload that had failed and then been deleted before syncing. The app had saved a thumbnail. It showed a small portion of a concrete wall, a red sleeve, and the edge of Mason's tan shoe on a dull basement floor. The image was time-stamped 1:19 p.m., 2 hours before the market footage. The thumbnail was too blurry to convict anyone alone. It was clear enough to make the lie physical. The theory changed. Mason had not disappeared from Marlowe's market. Audra had taken him from therapy to her house. He had been placed in the basement. The market scene had been staged with his backpack and clothing details. The question was whether he left Audra's house alive, and if so, with whom. For 3 days, investigators searched the ground around Audra's property with dogs and probes. They found nothing. No disturbed soil, no buried clothing, no hidden remains. That absence was the first mercy in the case, though no one dared call it that aloud. Opal Klein remembered a car in the alley behind Audra's house the night Mason disappeared. Not Dorian's blue pickup, but a beige sedan with one brake light dimmer than the other. She remembered it because it did not belong on Ramble Street, and because someone shut its trunk very softly, the way people do when they do not want a sound to carry. Caroline drove a beige sedan. The brake light had been replaced the week after Mason vanished. Her explanation was ready. She had come to Audra's house after leaving the annex to bring clothes because Audra was distraught and wanted not to be alone. Police logs complicated that. Caroline had been seen leaving the annex at 9:12 p.m. She returned at 10:01 with bottled water and blankets for volunteers. Ramble Street was 8 minutes each way. That left 33 minutes. 33 minutes was long enough to carry a sleeping child from a basement, put him in the back seat under a blanket, and drive to somewhere else. It was also long enough to do many innocent things. A case is built by refusing to let could pretend to be did. The money supplied the next map. Dorian had been asking questions about the Holloway Educational Trust, a fund created by Caroline's late father for Mason's care and schooling. Caroline controlled it. In the custody filings, Dorian requested an accounting because tuition charges, therapy costs, and caregiver invoices had risen sharply after the separation. Caroline had called the request harassment. Audra had been paid from the trust as a specialized care provider, not just a nanny, at a rate far above what she reported on taxes. In the year before Mason vanished, more than $60,000 had moved from the trust through caregiver reimbursements, therapy reimbursements, equipment fees, and consulting payments. Some were legitimate. Some had no supporting documents. Some went to Audra. Some went to a woman named Marnie Cale. Marnie Cale lived 3 counties west, outside a town of feed stores and flat winter fields called Tallowmere. She had once been Caroline's college roommate, though Caroline had not listed her among close friends. She operated a licensed daycare home for 6 years, lost the license after paperwork violations, and later ran a small reading cooperative out of a converted seed house. The cooperative was private enough to avoid much public attention and ordinary enough to sound harmless. Caroline had sent her 2 payments after Mason disappeared, both labeled consulting. Audra had sent her 1 payment in cash through a money order office 2 days before the disappearance. Dune and Sayer drove to Tallowmere in a county sedan with the heater broken and the case file stacked between them. The fields on either side of the road were cut low, stubbled and brown under a pewter sky. It was the kind of landscape where a person could see a mile in every direction and still hide a child behind one closed door. The converted seed house sat beyond a row of silver grain bins. It had cheerful painted letters over the entrance. Low Hill Reading Room. There were paper stars taped inside the windows and a muddy swing set at the edge of the yard. When Dune knocked, a woman with cropped gray hair opened the door only as wide as the chain allowed. She said there were no children present. A child's cough sounded behind her. The warrant arrived 42 minutes later. Inside, officers found 3 children whose parents had signed them in for afternoon reading, 2 elderly cats, shelves of worn picture books, and a locked storage room at the rear with a narrow bed, a plastic dresser, a space heater, and drawings taped to the wall. One drawing showed a house with 4 square windows and a sun too large for the page. Another showed a small shoe under a black rectangle. In the corner of the room, sitting on a rug with a book closed on his knees, was Mason Holloway. His hair was longer. His face had thinned. He wore sweatpants, a striped shirt, and cheap black sneakers too large for him. For a moment, when the officers came in, he did not cry or run. He looked at Dune's badge, then at the open door behind her, then down at his hands. He had the stillness of a child who had been taught that noise changed nothing. Dune crouched far enough away not to crowd him. "Mason," she said, keeping her voice low. "My name is Felicity. Your dad has been looking for you." The first adult he asked for wasn't his mother. It was not Audra. It was the father half the town had blamed. "Is my truck bed still blue?" he whispered. Dorian wasn't allowed to rush into the room. No one was. Mason was brought to a child advocacy center under medical supervision, examined, fed, and placed with emergency specialists until the court could decide how to handle a miracle that was also evidence. Caroline was arrested before she reached Tallowmere. Audra was arrested in the interview room after Dune told her Mason had been found alive and watched all the grief drain out of her face, replaced not by joy, but by calculation and something like relief. Mason's first formal interview was gentle and slow. He spoke through drawings more than sentences. He said Miss Audra took him to her house after speech because Mommy said there was a surprise and he had to practice being quiet. He said the basement smelled like laundry and old rain. He said he cried because he wanted his backpack. He said Audra told him the game would help Mommy keep him safe from Daddy's yelling. He said Mommy came when the lights were off. He remembered being carried in a blanket through the side door. He remembered kicking because one shoe felt twisted and hurt. He remembered Audra saying, "Leave it! Leave it! We do not have time!" That sentence gave meaning to the coal chute. In the hurried movement from basement to car, Mason's left shoe had come off. Whether he kicked it loose by accident or pushed it away deliberately, no one could know. It slid or was shoved under the old coal chute lip into the dark wedge behind the loosened brick. Audra, frantic and working by dim light, didn't find it. She sent Mason away with one shoe missing, and later convinced herself the basement held no witness capable of waiting 8 months. Children do not always leave evidence where adults expect. Sometimes they leave it where fear bends their foot. Caroline's first defense was maternal terror. She said Dorian was violent. She said the courts had failed to protect her. She said she believed Mason would be safer, hidden, until she could create a legal path away from his father. It was an argument built to use the town's old suspicion as scaffolding. But the trust records would not hold it. She had not moved money to protect Mason. She had used Mason's care expenses to cover personal debt, a failed investment with her brother, and payments to Audra that kept the nanny loyal. Dorian's custody petition had threatened to expose the accounting. If Mason vanished and Dorian became the chief suspect, the audit would stall, Caroline would remain the grieving custodial parent, and the trust would stay under her control. Audra's motive was smaller, sadder, and no less criminal. She had debts from a private caregiver course she never completed, tax notices she kept unopened in a kitchen drawer, and a long dependence on Caroline's praise. Caroline made Audra feel necessary, not employed, necessary. She told Audra that Mason would be taken by an angry father, ruined by court battles, frightened by strangers. She told her there were ways to protect a child that the law was too blunt to understand. She also paid her. The tenderness and the money braided together until Audra could no longer tell which one had tightened around her life first. The original plan, according to the reconstruction that emerged from app logs, bank records, and Mason's own fragments, was not meant to last 8 months. Audra would stage the market disappearance. Caroline would move Mason to Marnie Cale's Seed House apartment under the name Cody Rell. Dorian would be arrested, or, at minimum, buried under suspicion. After some period of public terror, Caroline would receive anonymous instructions, the sort that suggested Dorian had abandoned Mason elsewhere, or that a frightened accomplice had given him up. Mason would be found in another county, confused but alive, too young to explain the details clearly. Caroline would be heroic, Dorian destroyed, Audra forgiven as the victim of a father's cunning. The plan failed because Dorian was not arrested. It failed because Mason talked more than Caroline expected once he felt safe with Marnie. It failed because Marnie, who had believed she was helping an abused mother hide a child for a few days, began asking for more money when the days became weeks. It failed because every lie that must be maintained by 3 adults changes shape in 3 different minds. By autumn, Caroline could not safely bring Mason back without risking what he would say. Audra could not confess without admitting she had put him there. Marnie could not release him without facing kidnapping charges, so they waited, and waiting became its own prison. After Mason was found, search teams went back through every space he named. The basement at Ramble Street was photographed from his height. The side door was opened and closed, while microphones measured the scrape Opal Klein might have heard. The coal chute was removed brick by brick. Behind it, in addition to the lint and the shoe, Technicians found the torn corner of one laminated card. It showed the words, "I need Daddy." Audra had made the cards herself, bright and helpful and trusted. The torn piece had been wedged so deep that floodwater had not moved it. No one knew whether Mason tore it or Audra did. At the Seed House, investigators found Mason's red raincoat folded inside a flour sack, his green hoodie under a false bottom in a dresser, and 3 storybooks from Audra's basement with his name blacked out on the inside covers. In Marnie's desk were handwritten schedules Caroline had prepared. They did not say Mason. They said C, breakfast, C, quiet, C, walk only after dark if road empty. One page had a line underlined twice. Do not let him talk about Ramble. Caroline claimed the handwriting could be anyone's. It could not. Her accounting ledgers, birthday cards, and custody notes were compared. The C leaned open in the same peculiar way. The lowercase g curled backward. Even handwriting, which seems delicate and deniable, can become a blunt object in a courtroom. Marnie Cale pleaded first. Her statement did not save her, but it gave the case sequence. She said Caroline arrived the night Mason vanished with the boy half asleep in the back seat, one foot in a sock, the other still wearing a shoe. Caroline told her the missing shoe had been handled. Audra would say Mason wore both at the market. The camera would support enough. Dorian would break under pressure. Marnie said she believed none of it fully, and participated anyway, because Caroline had promised $10,000, and because she had once trusted Caroline's version of every man who disappointed her. When Dune told Dorian that Marnie had confirmed Mason left Audra's house alive in Caroline's car, he sat in the interview room and put both hands over his face. He did not make a sound at first. Then he said, "He asked about my truck." Dune said yes. Dorian laughed once, a broken little exhale that had no humor in it. "Everyone thought that truck took him," he said, and he remembered it like home. The reunion could not be the kind people imagined. Mason did not run across a room into his father's arms while cameras flashed. The court, doctors, and therapists kept everything slow. Dorian saw him first through an observation window. Mason sat at a low table with a social worker, sorting plastic beetles by color. Dorian pressed his palm to the glass and cried so hard his shoulders shook. Later, when they were allowed into the same room, he sat on the floor 6 feet away and opened a small metal toolbox. He had brought safe things, a rubber gasket, a clean bolt, a bus route badge without the pin. Mason looked at the pieces for a long time before crawling close enough to touch the gasket. Dorian did not grab him. He waited. That patience became the beginning of trust returning, not all at once, not like a door opening, but like a damaged hinge learning movement again. Audra changed her story 4 times before trial. First, she said the shoe was spare. Then she said, Caroline must have planted it. Then she said, Dorian threatened her and forced the staging. Finally, when faced with the app thumbnail, Opal's testimony, and Mason's interview, she admitted she took him to the basement, but insisted she believed she was saving him. Her confession was careful. It avoided words like kidnapped. It used words like shelter and calm room and temporary. Dune listened from the other side of the table and thought of the poster in the basement that said, "Use your brave voice." Mason had used his in scraps and drawings after every adult in the plan had tried to teach him silence. Caroline did not confess. Her defense was built around danger, desperation, and the failures of family court. It might have found sympathy if the evidence had not been so patient. The Nanny app logs, the traffic camera, the failed thumbnail, the payments, the side door note, the schedules in the Seed House, the replaced brake light, the trust withdrawals, the shoe. The shoe was displayed in court inside a clear evidence box, dry now, warped from floodwater, laces stiff. Jurors leaned forward when it was carried in. It looked too small to bear the weight placed on it. The yellow moon stitching had frayed at one edge. The black letters under the tongue were still legible if the light hit them correctly. Mason H. No witness cried louder than Caroline when it appeared, but tears, by then, had lost their authority. Mason did not testify in open court. His forensic interview was admitted with limits. The jury heard his small voice saying, "Miss Audra told me quiet was helping, and Mommy said I could come home when Daddy stopped being mad." No one moved while the recording played. Even Caroline's lawyer stopped taking notes. The verdict came on a wet April afternoon, almost a year after the disappearance, and 4 months after Mason was found. Caroline Holloway was convicted of kidnapping, conspiracy, custodial interference, obstruction, evidence tampering, and theft from the trust. Audra Keene was convicted of kidnapping, false reporting, obstruction, and conspiracy. Marnie Cale had already pleaded to kidnapping and unlawful restraint. The sentences were long enough that Mason would become an adult before any of the women most responsible for his disappearance could ask a parole board to measure remorse. Outside the courthouse, Dorian did not give the speech reporters wanted. He stood beneath the stone awning while rain trembled from its edge and said, "My son was not missing because I loved him wrong. He was missing because people lied and called it protection." Then he walked to the car where Mason waited with a therapist and a court officer, away from cameras. Mason grew slowly back into his own name. At first, he answered to Cody as often as Mason. He hid food in pillowcases. He asked whether court was over every time a doorbell rang. He wanted both shoes tied tightly, and then cried when they were too tight. Dorian learned not to rush the knots. He learned to ask before touching the laces. Caroline's relatives petitioned for contact and were denied until therapists could say what was safe. There was no single day when Mason became fine. Fine was not the point. Alive was the first fact. Safe had to be built. On the first anniversary of the day Audra reported him missing, Dorian took Mason to a small shoe store 2 towns over where nobody knew them on sight. Mason chose blue sneakers with white stripes and no moons. The clerk asked whether they wanted the box. Mason said yes, then changed his mind and said no. Dorian paid cash and carried the old shoes in his hand because Mason wanted to wear the new ones out. In the parking lot, Mason stepped into a shallow puddle and watched the water tremble around his toes. "Do you like them?" Dorian asked. Mason nodded. "They don't have my name inside." "We can write it if you want." Mason thought about that. Cars moved on the road beyond the lot. A cart rattled near the store doors. The world was ordinary in a way Dorian no longer trusted, but still wanted for him. "No," Mason said. "I know they're mine." Dorian put the empty box in the back seat and closed the door softly. Not because he was hiding anything, but because Mason startled at sharp sounds. Somewhere in evidence storage, the tiny moon shoe remained sealed in plastic, no longer lost, no longer waiting behind wet brick. It had done the only thing an object can do in a human lie. It had stayed where it was, carrying the shape of a foot, the name of a child, and the proof that the story told first was not the truth. The town had spent 8 months looking outward, toward a blue truck, a bitter father, a road out of Hearth Cross, a stranger with a child in his arms. The answer had been beneath a nanny's house, in the dark under laundry and craft paper, small enough for everyone to overlook and stubborn enough to outlast them. When people spoke of the case later, they often began with the shoe, because it was easier than beginning with the women who had smiled through searches, folded blankets for volunteers, and called a kidnapping an act of love. But Dorian, when Mason was old enough to ask, began somewhere else. He began with a boy who remembered a blue truck as home. He began with a detective who kept asking what happened before the story started. He began with a plumber who stopped work because a shoe in water felt wrong. He began with the fact that Mason had not vanished at a market. He had been taken from a day that should have been ordinary by adults who trusted their own fear more than his life. And then, only then, he told him about the shoe.